Hello, thanks for joining us again. Let me just go ahead and get right into it and share my screen. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be comparing and contrasting the post-tribulation view of the rapture with the pre-wrath view of the rapture. If you have not already watched the post-tribulation rapture video or the pre-wrath video, you probably want to do that first so that this will make a lot more sense. So let's just start with a comparison, meaning the areas where pre-wrath and post-tribulation positions agree. And they agree on a lot of things. So I wanted to start with that positive aspect. First off, they agree that many required signs before the rapture, there are many required signs before the rapture will occur. Both post-tribulation and pre-wrath positions acknowledge that there will be numerous signs before the rapture happens. Now, if you have not already watched our End Times Chronology episodes, you would want to watch those. It goes through Matthew 24 and the parallel passages of Luke 21 and Mark 13, describing those specific numerous signs. And so both of these positions agree with that. The pre-trib position does not agree with these two on this. But according to this, let me just go quickly through those signs as a review that must occur before the rapture happens. False teachers, famines, earthquakes, rebellions, wars, pestilence. The abomination of desolation must be set up by the Antichrist in the temple. There's persecution of Christians by the Antichrist, an increase in lawlessness. The gospel must be preached worldwide. And then there's the cosmic disturbances, which we'll get into more detail a little later. So these cosmic disturbances being like the sun darkened, the moon turning to blood, earthquakes, and hail. So all those are required before the rapture happens, and that is described in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and both the post-trib and pre-wrath positions affirm this. So next, they also agree that the Great Tribulation is the persecution of the church, although we'll get into later that they don't call that time Great Tribulation. The post-trib does not. But they do agree that there must be persecution of the church by the Antichrist. And the whole point of the Great Tribulation is that the Antichrist is persecuting the church. So it makes absolutely no sense for the church to be gone. And that's what the pre-trib affirms. So just to go into it a little bit, early church fathers repeated over and over the idea that the believers would face a final, what they called stumbling block. Some of them called it a contest, some of them fire of testing. The early church fathers never mentioned tribulation saints, which is something the pre-trib position believes and encourages. The early church fathers would actually be very surprised to think that anyone would suggest that the church would be exempted from what I'm calling these final exams. It was their expectation that they would be persecuted, and most of the early church fathers died as martyrs. The concept of being spared from persecution is completely foreign to them. They considered it a privilege and a badge of honor. In fact, Ignatius, one of the early church fathers, feared that his supporters would petition the emperor Trajan, to prevent him from being martyred. So he begs them not to interfere so that his execution can actually go forward, which is something we think is probably ridiculous today, but that is actually the mentality of these early church fathers. They wanted to identify so fully with Christ that they wanted to fellowship with him in their suffering. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. All right, this next point is that the return of Christ and rapture will happen at the same time. Now, if the pre-trib rapture was true, it would require that Jesus have two second comings separated by 7 years. And let me explain that, because when the rapture is described in the Bible, it describes the Christians meeting Jesus in the air. So that means he's coming down in the air, but then they describe like a secret rapture. And so why would he come down and then come down again later at this? The Bible does not describe two second comings. And in order for us to believe the pre-trib, they actually act like there is, but that isn't there. And that is one thing that post-trib and pre-wrath agree on. They're like, nope, that doesn't happen. The sign of Christ's return appears, believers go up and meet Jesus in the sky, and then they immediately come back down together. All right, and another area is that the entire Bible is unified with Jesus as the central theme. So where I'm going at with this relates to the dispensational beliefs of pre-tribbers. So biblical passages should not be separated by what applies to the church or to Israel, as dispensationalists attempt to do. The promises that were given to Abraham are fulfilled in the church. All believers will enjoy the promised land during the millennial kingdom. This will not just be the Jews. There are not different ways to obtain salvation at different times in history, and that's what dispensationalists will say. They'll say during this period of time, God deals with the people in this way, and this is how they achieved salvation or met the goal or whatever. And no, it's always been grace through faith in the Old and the New Testaments. It did not change. That is salvation. That was how it was obtained by Abraham as well. You look in Hebrews 11 and it describes all of that. So this is what post-trib and pre-wrath agree on, that there is not separate ways of dealing with Israel and the church. Now let's talk about some of the ways that they are different in our contrast section. They have differing terms that are used. So post-tribulationists tend to use the same theological terms used by the pre-tribulationists to describe Daniel's 70th week, the wrath of God, and the day of the Lord. And this can lead to some confusion. So they call Daniel's 70th week, that 7-year period, the tribulation. But if you're actually to look in the Bible, it doesn't ever call it that. Prewrath position maintains that the Bible never mentions a 7-year tribulation. It describes only a 3.5-year period that is called the Great Tribulation. The 7-year period should be referred to as Daniel's 70th week or 7-year period. So don't call that whole chunk of time the tribulation. It should just be the last half is the Great Tribulation. And because post-tribs align with pre-trib in describing that term, it can lead to lots of confusion. Post-tribs also consider the latter half of the 7-year period, that 3.5 years, the second half, to be God's wrath and the day of the Lord. They call all that whole period of time the day of the Lord. However, God's wrath doesn't begin until the day of the Lord, as is affirmed by the pre-wrath position. And that day of the Lord does not occur until after those cosmic disturbances happen in seal 6, trumpet 7, and bowl 7. So it causes some problems for post-trib to think of that whole 3.5 years as the wrath of God or the day of the Lord. They should put it toward the end after the rapture. All right, so another area in which they differ is the differing interpretations on timing of the seals, trumpets, and bowls. So if you've not watched the presentations on seals, trumpets, or bowls, you would probably want to watch that so you understand where I'm coming with this. The post-tribulationists see these judgments in Revelation as all overlapping, but with varying degrees of judgment. So to understand that, for example, some of the trumpets say that 1/3 of the oceans are turned to blood, or 1/3 of the rivers are turned to blood. And whereas the bowls goes all the way and says that they are all turned to blood by that point. So I can see where they're coming with their varying degrees of judgment, but they basically overlay them all on top of each other. Now, the pre-wrath, at least the textbook version, meaning the people who write the books about pre-wrath and promote this view, they see the seals, trumpets, and bowls as consecutive events, and they don't see the overlap. They see one going into the other, the way that is laid out in the scripture. So because they see that, they kind of differ with post-tribulationists on when all of this stuff is happening. It just starts to get a little messy after a while, the way that they're describing it, but they really see it lining up that way. Now, what do I believe? I believe they're actually both incorrect on this issue, and let me explain that. I think it's best and most helpful to instead line up the descriptions of those actual bowl seals and trumpets to discover where they overlap. And when you do, if you actually read through the language of it, you would see that seals 6 and 7 describe the same events as trumpet 7 and bowl 7. They describe those cosmic disturbances, in fact, using the exact same language. They say that the sun is darkened, the moon is turned to blood or turns red, there's thunders, lightning, hail, gigantic hail, an earthquake that flattens every mountain. Now, key to understanding this is an earthquake, and it's not described as ever doing this. Like, if it flattens all these mountains, how would it happen if from the Prewrath position? How could it happen over and over again? So if it happens in seal 6, then all the trumpets happen, and it happens again in seal 7, trumpet 7, and then all the bowls happen. It happens again in bowl 7. I mean, what is all these mountains being formed again and then being flattened again? That just makes absolutely no sense. So to me, it makes sense to say this: the rapture happens after these cosmic disturbances. Those cosmic disturbances are described in this seal 6 and 7, trumpet 7, and bowl 7. Then the rapture happens, and then the day of the Lord begins. I just think seeing it that way makes it so much clearer. However, it's important not to be dogmatic on this, because, you know, it's really hard when you look in Revelation, unlike the Olivet Discourse that kind of lays it out in a chronological sequence, Revelation kind of jumps in with certain things at times, and it can get a little confusing. So it's important not to be completely dogmatic about that and fight over that kind of thing. I think it might play out a little differently than we expect, and things might be a little more jumbled than we know. I do want to point out in Revelation 16:15 that it says, "Look, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who is alert and remains clothed, so that he may not go around naked and people see his shame." Now that's inserted in Revelation 16. It's describing the 6th bowl, and then it'll go on later to describe the 7th bowl, but that is inserted right between the two of them. So that language about a thief is seen in the Olivet Discourse, it's seen in Thessalonians, and it's referring to the rapture. So it's kind of a clue that that might be where the rapture is inserted as far as where the bowls go. So between the 6th and 7th bowl. So I just find that very interesting. I'm not going to be dogmatic at it. I'm just pointing it out that that is a possibility, that it could be a reference to Jesus' return and rapture. Another clue is in Revelation 7, and that's verse 16. When believers who come out of the great tribulation in heaven, you'll see them in that chapter. It kind of jumps into heaven. And it says in verse 16, it's referring to those believers that came out of the great tribulation. It says they will no longer hunger. They will no longer thirst. The sun will no longer strike them, nor will any scorching heat. Now that is just very specific, those last two phrases, the sun no longer striking them and no scorching heat. It suggests that they may have experienced it, since it will be such good news that they won't have to repeat that. So now that they're in heaven, they're like, you don't have to go through any of that again. The hunger, the thirst, that's pretty vague. But specifically the scorching heat, well, let me tell you where that comes into play. That is bowl 4, when the sun scorches people on earth. So that kind of suggests that Christians will have experienced that. They will not, like post-tribs, think they're completely protected from everything. Apparently not that one. And it also shows that it's possible that those bowls are happening before the rapture occurs. Okay, and now I want to go into one final thing to look at when you're trying to see where the rapture occurs. A key is to look for the word wrath. So since we're going up before the wrath, look at where the wrath appears among the seals, trumpets, and bowls. So look at seal 6. In Revelation 6:2, that's to kind of show you that we're at the 6th seal. It's describing in that whole context. It says, when he opened the 6th seal. Now I am only skipping. You're welcome to look at it on your own to verse 16, so just for time's sake. So go down to verse 16 and 17. We know we're talking about the 6th seal because of verse 2. It says, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? So those two words, wrath, appear in that verse 16 and 17. But it's the first time that word is used when describing the seals. So that to me is a clue of when Christians are raptured. So they're raptured before that time during seal 6. Now, if you look down at trumpet 7, Revelation 11, 15, and 18 describes them, and it says, verse 15 is, then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and then we're skipping to 18 because, it just describes more details about it. The nations raged, but your wrath came. So that is where it happens in the trumpets. So you see that trumpet 7 is the place where the church would be raptured. Now looking at bowls 1 through 7, Revelation, the whole entire chapter of 15 and 16 describes the bowls. And 15 verse 1 says, for with them God's wrath will be completed. 15:7 says, one of the 4 living creatures gave them, the 7 angels, 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. So once again, we see the words wrath, and all of those bowls are about wrath. Now, as I just described prior, saying that some of those bowls may be experienced by believers, expect that that's a possibility. But this is right here describing wrath, meaning all of the bowls. So I think that just should be a question in our minds, a place to just think about it. To me, it kind of makes sense that if bowl 7 is where the rapture is happening, then all the other bowls will have to have happened first. So that part is something I'm still pondering and wondering about, and love your feedback on that. So just wanted to show you those keys to kind of understanding where this happens. Thank you for joining us. And I do want you to know that I'm sure this list is not exhaustive as far as the differences and or similarities between pre-wrath and post-trib, but I just wanted to give you a few that I was able to think of.